Hi, and welcome to another installment of the Landscape Management Network's newsletter videos. In this video, we're going to take a look at a very common mistake in adding profit, or what you think is profit, to your jobs. This simple oversight is made by more than 8 out of every 10 contractors, and if you don't understand this mistake, then it's costing you money. Dan is a landscape contractor, and he's the owner of Danscaping Inc. He's your typical landscaper. He's owned his own landscape contracting business for 15 years now. And at first his business grew quickly, but then it started to level off, and he'd never quite been able to take his business, or its profits, to where he really believed it should be. Dan earned profit, in most years anyway, but Dan never earned the profit he felt he should. He believed his prices had enough cushion built into them, but year after year, the statements came back from his accountant saying the same thing. He was doing okay, but not great. He earned a profit, but he never earned the profit that he was certain he was building into his jobs. And year after year, his actual profit failed to live up to what he expected. But Dan had always priced his work for profit. He'd always remembered a great piece of advice given to him in the past. Never start a job until you know what it's going to cost. And Dan had done his best to live by those words, always pricing his jobs based on the cost of his labor, material, equipment, and subs, and then adding markups to cover his overhead and profit. And Dan felt like he shot for a fair profit. In years where the economy was good, Dan looked for around 15% net profit. And when things slowed down, Dan dropped his expectations too. He had to keep up with the market, and he felt like he had control over his numbers. He was certainly ahead of some of the other contractors he knew. But no matter what Dan aimed for, the actual results were always something less. Things changed one day when, of all things, Dan was helping his daughter with her homework. They were learning how to calculate profit margins. And Dan could write this formula in his sleep. Having run his business for 15 years, it was his favorite formula, and he proudly drew it out for her. The formula for a profit margin, he explained, is price minus cost, and then divided by price. Next, Dan decided he would show his daughter with a real-life example, since she'd been asking for a bike. They looked at the bike in the catalog, and Dan showed her the price. It was $120. Dan then told his daughter to assume that the store paid $100 to buy the bike. So the price was $120, and the cost was $100. Dan's daughter took the numbers and plugged them into her formula for profit. And while she did the math, Dan got up to get a juice. Starting at the top, Dan's daughter subtracted the cost from the price to get $20. $120 minus $100 is $20. She then divided the $20 by the price, $120, to get her final answer. And proud of her answer, she held up the paper for Dan. 16.67%, Dad, she said. Dan had his head stuck in the fridge. He'd sworn he'd just bought some juice the other day, but couldn't quite find it. So he mumbled back at her. Not quite, honey, he said. $120 is a 20% profit. So do your math again and check the numbers very closely. Puzzled, Dan's daughter put her head down again and did the equation again. Price minus cost divided by price. 120 minus 100 leaves 20, and 20 divided by the price equals the same thing, 16.67%. I did it again, Dad, she said, and it's still 16%. This time Dan closed the fridge and he walked over. You're doing something wrong, he explained. 20% profit on $100 is $120. Let me show you how it works. So Dan got out his pencil and his calculator and he did the numbers with his daughter, and sure enough, he also got 16.67%. So he punched it in again, and again he got the same result. Now Dan called for his wife, asking her when they last changed the batteries in this calculator. And his daughter scoffed at him. Don't be silly, Daddy. Let's just write this answer and keep going. And while his daughter continued, Dan struggled to look for the answer. How could this be? He scribbled his thoughts on paper. 20% of $100 is $20. And 100 plus 20 is obviously 120, so what could be wrong? And then with the numbers right there in front of him on paper, Dan found the missing piece. $20 is 20% of $100. But $100 is the cost of the bike, not the price. The price of the bike is $120. $20 is only 16.67% of $120, the price. So that was it. Dan was adding 20% of the cost to come up with a 20% profit. But that was leaving him a little bit short every time, because the formula for our actual profit margin is price minus cost divided by price. And so if $20 is only 16.67% of the price, 120, that's why his profit margin was coming out at 16%. Now, this only served to get Dan worrying again. What had happened to all the work he'd priced in the past? He'd always used the old formula, $100 plus 20%, or $100 times 1.2 to come up with his price. Using this formula, he would have assumed he'd had 20% profit on this job. But now we could see that he had something less than 20%. In this case, he only had 16.67%. So now Dan wondered, how could he find what a 20% profit was truly on $100? So he reached for his daughter's textbook. These things do come in handy. And he found the formula was simple as the one he'd been using. It was just switched around a little. To find a true profit margin on the cost, the formula is easy. You simply need to take the cost and divide it by 1 minus the profit margin you're looking for. Dan tried the formula on the bike example. He took the cost, $100, and divided it by 1 minus the profit margin they were looking for, which was 20%. 1 minus 20% is actually 1 minus 0.2. And 1 minus 0.2 equals 0.8. So to find a 20% profit margin on 100, Dan takes the $100 and divides it by 0.8. And the answer was 125. It didn't look right to Dan, so he tried that price for the formula for a profit margin. He took the price minus the cost and divided it by the price to get 125 minus 100 divided by 125. 125 minus 100 equals 25. So to find this profit margin, he divides 25 by 125. And his answer, of course, is 20%, the profit margin that Dan was looking for. Dan's old method, adding the profit margin to the cost, is called a profit markup. You're marking up the cost by a percentage to come up with the price. It's a valid formula, but it's not going to give you a correct profit margin. To find a profit margin, you need to divide the cost by 1 minus the profit margin you're looking for. The reason it's so important to use a margin is because that it's a profit margin that your accountant tells you that you earned or lost at the end of the year. Your accountant is taking your sales, subtracting your costs, and dividing by your sales again to find your company's net profit margin. If you want to hit a true profit margin, not something less than the profit margin, you need to use the formula for a margin, not the formula for a markup. If you're using a markup formula to add profit to your jobs, you're losing a few points on every bit of work that you price, just with a simple math error. Worse yet, the bigger the profit margin you're looking for, the bigger the error gets. Look at the table now on the screen to see how this difference grows as the margin gets bigger. A 10% profit markup is really only a 9% profit margin. You're losing 1% net profit before you even put a shovel in the ground. But a 20% net profit is only a 16.67% profit margin. There goes 3 1/3% right off your bottom line. And at a 30% markup, you can see that's only really a 23% profit margin. 7% of your expected profit is disappearing before you even hand the estimate to the customer. Now that he's using a true profit margin, Dan's much more sure how much profit is built into his price. He's pricing jobs more accurately, with a correct profit margin. He's negotiating better with his clients. Previously, the markup method led Dan to believe that the margins he had built into his jobs were higher, and he was giving away too much of what was actually left of profit in the negotiations phase because of his mistaken belief in a higher profit margin. And now his entire business has a healthier bottom line. Fixing his profit math calculations were the easiest few points of net profit that Dan had ever added to his business. Thanks for watching. We're the Landscape Management Network, and we help great landscape contractors build great landscape businesses. If you want to see more of our tools, systems, and education for budgeting, estimating, and systemizing your landscape company, check out our website at www.landscapemanagementnetwork.com. At just $99 a month, there's never been a more affordable, more effective way to grow a profitable landscape company.